Heat has broken and it's a gorgeous morning, so I'm very excited we have such a great audience today. I'm Gwen Young. I'm the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project here at the Wilson Center. And we're very honored to have Dr. Marjorie Spruill here today, who is a former Wilson Center Fellow before my arrival, but we are reconnecting and we're scheming. We already have November planned about how we're going to continue to keep changing the world, but we're very honored to have her here today. The Women in Public Service Project has a relatively simple and yet very ambitious goal of trying to ensure that by 2050, 50% of government leadership positions are held by women across the globe. So it's a challenging environment as we're trying to get women elected and trying to get the institutions and momentum. So this event today on the 1977 National Women's Conference is a part of this movement that we've all been doing for a while and that we continue to do to make sure we achieve gender parity. And as you said, and I think in the book what would be interesting today to discuss is the political discourse. What are we talking about and how are we talking about this? So we are honored to have Wilson Center Fellow Marjorie Spruill joining us, who wrote the book we are discussing today called Divided We Stand, and you see it up here in the front, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics. You have her bio, and to some of you in the room, I know she is no stranger, but she recently retired from teaching, as I understand, and was a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. She specializes in U.S. history, particularly women's and gender history in the U.S. and the history of the American South. We were just talking in the back room how we were saying how the journalists are able to turn out their research and books in 6 to 9 months, and the history professors, you were saying, take 3 to 4 years? But it's good because it's in-depth and a deep dive. She's also the author of New Women of the New South, the leaders of the women's suffrage movement in the southern states. She's co-edited several publications on women's history in the American South, including a 2-volume anthology on women in Mississippi and a 3-volume anthology on women in South Carolina. She was a fellow here in 2010 to 2011, and we're so happy to have her back. And Marjorie, I'd love for you to come up here and read an excerpt from your book and get us started on a great and engaging discussion. Welcome to the Wilson Center again.
Well, it is just great to be here. And I remember this particular room so very well, sitting here giving, each fellow gives reports from time to time on their work, and so just all the ideas, all the things I learned from all the other fellows sitting in this room, let alone any contribution that I made. It is, I very much appreciate this invitation, that very nice introduction. And I really want to say to the Wilton Center that I will be eternally grateful for having that year here and all the opportunities it gave me. Also, my husband, Don Doyle, who's right here, was working on his book as an associate here that year as well. And we just both made a lot of progress, as well as just, it was incredibly stimulating. There were some interesting moments. I remember very vividly when David Greenberg, who had a sharp deadline at the end of the year, was less appreciative than some of the rest of us of the really great salsa band that was playing right outside the windows, and had a bit of a fit to calling for, anyway. But there's always something going on around here, that's for sure, and I learned a lot while I was there. It's just great to have access, to be in this city, to have access to the Library of Congress and the National Archives, but also the terrific Wilson Center Library, run by Janet Spikes. And also, during the time I was here, I had the assistance of not 1, but 3 fantastic interns. Any interns in here? The help was just much appreciated in that program run Krishna Annual. And Sonia Michelle, I see here, who was the director of the U.S. programs at the time, and we just had a great time talking to each other, both of us with our interest in women's history. And I try not to remember the fact that on John Maluski's television program, when he interviewed us in conversation, in 2011, saying something about having the book ready like within a year. Unfortunately, they have that on tape. But so it is wonderful to finally finish this book that that began with a small focused topic and grew and grew and ended up becoming, shall I say, all too relevant to our contemporary affairs. It concerns the transformation of American political culture in the 70s and the origins of this highly partisan, deeply polarized political climate that we now, I was about to say inhabit, but I think I'll say endure. It is somewhat unusual among books about politics because the book puts women at the center of the story, and it's somewhat unusual in books in women's history because I'm trying to discuss both women's rights advocates and conservative women in one volume and in relation to one another. So I emphasize that there was not one but two women's movements in the 70s, a women's rights movement that enjoyed tremendous success, changed our world, opened up all kinds of opportunities that certainly benefited people my age, but even more younger women that came behind us, and women of all ages and all beliefs. And then there was also, and I should add that especially early in the decade, it was at a time when conservative women had not yet begun to organize, and politicians believed that if they were going to court women voters, that they needed to cater to feminist ideas. It was extraordinarily effective. And then coming second was a conservative women's movement that was formed in opposition and grew stronger as the decade continued. And my argument is that these two movements were not only antagonistic but mutually influential, and that together they played an essential role in the making of modern American political culture. Tensions between feminists and their conservative critics exploded in 1977 during a series of state and national conferences called International Women's Year, or IWI conferences, culminating in a national women's conference held in November 1977 in Houston, Texas. Now these were, the terminology is a little confusing, they were known as the International Women's Year Conferences because of their UN origins, and yet they are unique in American history as federally sponsored assemblies to which women were invited to tell Congress and the President what women wanted. Now, like Gloria Steinem, who called the National Women's Conference a constitutional convention and says that in her own life she measures everything as whether it happened before or after Houston, and Phyllis Schlafly, who regarded IWI as a crucial strategic error on the part of feminists that played right into her own hands. She, in fact, called it the Battle of Midway in the war between feminists and social conservatives that determined what the future would bring. So it was very interesting to me to find that these two women on opposite sides both said that this was earth-shaking, a watershed event, and that both of them claimed it as a victory. So that really caught my attention and suggested that there was a lot more that needed to be learned about these events. After Houston, as they came to call it, the National Women's Conference that Gloria also has described as the most important event that nobody knows about, American politics would never be the same. The IWI conferences were held in 1977, but they were products of an earlier period in U.S. history, one so different from the politics of today as to be almost unimaginable when the feminist movement was on the ascendancy and politicians in both parties felt obliged to support it. In the early 70s, all three branches of the federal government took steps that furthered feminist goals. There was progress also at the international level. The conference, as I said, were inspired by a worldwide movement promoted by the United Nations, which declared 1975 to 85 as the decade for women. In 1975, the UN sponsored the first IWI conference, which took place in Mexico City, and there they produced a world plan of action. President Gerald Ford appointed the National Commission on the Observance of International Women's Year to coordinate U.S. participation. He was eager for the United States to be seen as in the lead in this international movement for women's rights. He also directed the Commission to spend a great deal of time doing research and devising recommendations for making the United States a more perfect union in regard to women's equality. So in late 75, at the urging of Congresswoman Bella Abzug and Patsy Mink and others inspired by the Mexico City conference, Congress mandated these IWI meetings to be held in every single state and territory where it would be open to all and that all American women who wished to participate could come and they could talk about resolutions and vote on delegates to send on to Houston, where they would assemble to adopt officially this national plan of action that was supposed to guide future policies relating to women. And the Houston conference and the preliminary state meetings leading up to it proved to be thoroughly polarizing events. As women's rights supporters put aside their differences and united behind an expansive set of feminist goals, conservative women who were opposed to any one of those goals joined forces to oppose them that had enduring consequences for the nation. So Divided We Stand draws the connection between the events that divided American women in the 70s and the subsequent polarization of American politics at large as the two major parties chose up sides in 1980 between feminist and the conservative challengers. Whereas in early 1970, both Republicans and Democrats supported the modern women's rights movement, by 1980, the GOP had taken the side of the other women's movement, the one that positioned family values as opposed to women's rights. So through Divided We Stand, my goal was to provide insights into contemporary politics by describing the growing power of feminism within the governing establishment, the growth of the conservative opposition, and the competition between them for influence in American politics. An epilogue brings the story from 1980 up through November 2016. It is, all in all, a reminder that progress is not linear, that everyone doesn't have the same idea about what constitutes progress, and that gains that feminists believe are irreversible are not. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'd already sort of taken notes and then I'm adding to them. So why don't we launch into the title and your last statement about progress not being linear, and bring that down to, you've talked about, in some ways, the rise of the feminist movement, the rise of the conservative, social conservative movement, conservative critics movement. They're both rising, the competition's rising. But what more do you mean by progress is not linear? What progress has been made despite the unity or despite certain pieces of legislation?
Well, a lot of that progress that was made in the 70s has not been reversed. A whole lot of that, the progress that was made, benefited women of all political beliefs. When doors were opened, such as when or barriers broken down, such as in 1964 when protection against gender discrimination was added to protection against racial discrimination in the '64 Civil Rights Act, something that Congresswoman Martha Griffith and Senator Margaret J. Smith helped make happen. That helped women of all kinds. And it is very difficult for me to imagine anybody reversing that, although we have not been able to get the equal pay legislation that we want. And by the way, Phyllis Schlafly, about 2 years ago, opposed that on the grounds that it would weaken the American family because men didn't want their wives to earn more than they did. But at any rate, there are lots of other things that have been celebrated by women regardless of their party or whether they're from the left or the right, such as Title IX, which, and the part on sports. The part on striking down stereotyping in school books, however, definitely was contested, and Schlafly, in fact, called removal of stereotypes about our gender roles from textbooks as what do you call it? Child abuse. Child abuse. Because it denied children of their correct gender identity. So there are a couple of ways in which I think the conservative women's movement was able to roll back feminist gains. One of them is simply on the terminology and the fact that by taking the ideas of the most extremely radical feminist, and even among those and the ones that phrased it in a particularly a way that's unappealing to the mainstream Americans, and then taking that to speak for the entire movement, they have been, in fact, one of the main themes in this book is about women, feminists working within the establishment. These moderate feminists, in fact, the ones who've gotten a lot less attention, women like Catherine East, who worked behind the scenes and was sort of the leader of the feminist underground among women workers in the federal government, and truth be known, was the one who persuaded Betty Friedan to become president of NOW and to engage with that in the first place. But at any rate, there were all these people who were making a lot of progress, and what they did was to basically tarnish the reputation of the whole movement by emphasizing the extreme radicalism of a few, and really playing up things that would be alienating to the American public. So for many years, we feminists have had to endure watching generation after generation, including our students, say how, avoid that word like the plague, and that was a major victory for the conservative women's movement. And the other one, of course, is to make major progress from their perspective in terms of restricting access to abortion. And that is a huge gain for them. And again, language has made such a difference by claiming the pro-life rather than anti-abortion label. And in changing a lot of the policies and rhetoric, they've expanded the numbers of people who believe that that is wrong and ought to be curtailed. But it's above all, I believe that that most of the gains have remained. I think that it was a psychological blow, big time, for the women's movement when the ERA failed. And it leaves us vulnerable, and it leaves these gains vulnerable. But so far, the tendency on the courts has been to continue to move in the direction that has been beneficial to the women's movement, with just some recent exceptions that, like the Hobby Lobby case, that really sounds a bell. and makes us realize that that again, progress is not guaranteed and things can be reversed.
Do you think that there's, not to be too controversial, right, but now, sort of 2017 or up until 2016, more possibilities around something like the Equal Rights Amendment or particular policies for these two groups to come together that would be different than in the mid to late 70s?
I'd like to think so. I have less hope that advocacy groups on either side would come together than I have that women in Congress would come together. In other words, the ones who actually have some power right now, rather than those who are trying to influence it from either side. I don't know about you, but I've been enormously encouraged several years ago when there was the shutdown of the government. That's not encouraging, I know, but when the shutdown of the government was resolved after women members of Congress initiated something among them to get past that impasse. And I think it was extraordinary last week how we saw 3 Republican women senators save the nation, save 23 million people from losing their health care. And it was especially interesting given that the health care bill that they were opposing was drafted very deliberately with the exclusion of women, and for reasons that are really not clear. You know, I don't believe that, given all the concern with optics and politics today, that was any accident. And so it was. They can have real power, and they exercised it. And, you know, it just wouldn't surprise me a bit, and I would just absolutely love to see it, if a bipartisan group within each House of Congress, initiated by these women, but including men, would step up to the mark and show us the way to get past the bitter partisanship and actually look out for the interest of the country, including women's health issues.
I was going to ask that. Do you think it sounds a bit like you're saying where the weight or the hope is now is in the women in formal office, going back to sort of the women in government versus the distinction you make between the advocacy groups, and wanted to talk about that and then come off that a bit also to talk about how important is it to have men's voices? Clearly not all of them around the table to the exclusion of women, but how important is the male voice in this today? Is it changed at all from previous?
I think it's always been extremely important, and it always will be. So maybe I might have misunderstood your question.
Yeah. But just to, well, the first question was, where's going to be the power of bringing the sort of the movement together? Is it going to come from within informal office? Is that going to be easier, do you think, than bringing the advocacy groups together? Well,
the advocacy groups are, I certainly did not mean to suggest that they are not important. They're very important. I think that health care bill would have gone through had it not been for the voices of protest that were raised all over the country, and the advocate groups have been amazing, including new advocacy groups that have come out since January in making it clear to politicians that there was widespread objection to this bill. So those are very important there. But I was saying, in terms of sitting down together and forging, getting past the bitter partisanship and forging a new path, that's where I see women in Congress having a real opportunity. And it seems, based on what they've done before, a real inclination to act across party lines. And I'm very hopeful about that.
No, that's great. That's actually, but you know, aside from sort of changing legislation and working across party lines within the formal structures themselves, what can these political figures do in terms of the discourse and the language that exists outside, let's say, the walls of Congress or the executive branch? What role can they play in changing that language or that discourse?
Well, I guess we've seen a few examples in our history where politicians up in front of a crowd didn't just cheer the crowd on, but used that opportunity to make it clear what they think civil discourse ought to be about. The most obvious one is John McCain, who's on everyone's mind right now. When he was running for president and was confronted by that woman who said that Obama was a Muslim. And he said, no, stop this, let's wait a minute. And then he proceeded not just to say Obama's not a Muslim, but to talk about his respect for him as a worthy opponent. Doesn't this seem like ancient history? Instead of having someone who encourages the conflict, eggs people on, that has been one of the most unfortunate things I've seen in recent politics, is the encouragement of the decline of civic discourse.
And last question, I have so many, but I know we have a very engaged and interested audience. Coming back to some of the issues that sort of didn't make it through in the 70s, you mentioned equal pay, right? There's affordable child care, there's parental leave. Is there a particular issue right now that you think we could galvanize that could sort of, make it past the test to get that unity or to get that unified policy?
Well, I certainly think that the whole nation's focused on health care right now, and I'd love to see people come together and let that be a clear example of getting something done across party lines. One of the things that would most help families in this country would be some more help about child care. And that is one of the most obvious and complete failures of the feminist movement to meet its goals. But however, as I say that, what I would like to say is it was not their failure, because we tried very hard and almost got there. So it is more the, I'm not presenting it as a failure as much as a goal that was not attained. And what's really amazing is how close we came to attaining it. Because in that period I described in the early 70s, the Congress of 71-72 went down in history as passing more pro-women's rights legislation than all of the others before. It's just extraordinary. Bella Abzug said, who would oppose equality for women and women's rights? And she said, so we added women's rights to every bill, everywhere we could. And nobody said, stopped up. ERA just passed overwhelmingly. In the Senate, there were only 8 opposing votes. Yep. And during that time, there was the Walter Mondale, and somebody remind me the name of the other, Bradamus, whose bill, comprehensive child care proposal that would have caught the United States up, or close, thanks Sonia, to what was being done in other leading industrialized countries, or at least the closest we've ever come, and had passed both houses of Congress. And one of the little details that I put in the book is how it came about that Nixon vetoed it. Because, as I mentioned, he was supporting so many feminist proposals, even though he privately was somewhat hostile to feminism. And what happened there, and this blew my mind when I first realized it, there's a woman named Connie Marshner, whom some of you may know. She has been a very influential figure at the Heritage Foundation. But in 1971, she was a recent graduate of the University of South Carolina. She had tried to get a teaching job and hadn't gotten one, so she ended up taking a job as a secretary with the Young Americans for Freedom organization. And one day she was given this bill to type, and she read it and was horrified, went home, and started writing about all the things that were wrong with it from her point of view. And Richard Viguerie, who at that time was just pioneering the direct mail mailing, was there, and they decided that they would send out a letter detailing the opposition that she had found, to their whole mailing list of conservatives, urging them to write Nixon. And Nixon was just inundated with letters. One of the first examples of a politician being affected very much by that kind of mailing. And it was also assigned to Viguerie and the others who later become known as the New Right, that there are all these people out there who are parents who were upset about the way the government has been developing and would respond to a call like that. And that's why that event kind of stood out during that period. And then, of course, Pat Buchanan, who was Nixon's speechwriter, tried to write Nixon's veto message in such a way as to thoroughly discredit as socialistic, and Sovietization was, I believe, the word they used, and which in those days Republicans were opposed to, by the way.
Yeah.
And,
funny how that works.
Funny how that works. And so he tried to do that, to write it in such a way as to sink it for good. And after that, it was very hard for anybody to bring it back up again.
You touched on one thing that I was going to ask, which is a bit controversial. This word, feminist, is that still the appropriate word? Is there a possibility of putting a positive spin on that? Is progressive the new word, or how important is that?
Well, I think both of those are hot terms right now, in style. And the feminism, even before the last election, was, as a term, was being reclaimed and was becoming a very positive term again. Mm-hmm. And it was helped along by the likes of Emma Watson, Beyonce, and Laura Bush, and lots of other people. I believe, dare I say, Sarah Palin actually used that term. However, that began to make everyone very confused as to what it meant.
Which means politics are still linked, no matter how partisan.
So the term has been embraced by such a variety of people in recent days that it's kind of confusing as to what it means. But I regard that coming from the perspective of the women's movement as the fact that term has become one embraced by widely popular figures, including ones who resonate with young women and who young women want to emulate, as a very positive development.
That's interesting, too, because as you said, there's other parts of society that are weighing in, from actors and so forth, and then you can go back to the women in office and do it along party lines. And so it'll be interesting to see that interplay. Mm-hmm. I would love to open it up for questions. We have microphones, which we encourage you, in fact, you need to use so that we can get everything captured. And why don't you help by introducing yourself? I think Sonia can start over here. Tell us where you're from, and in typical Wilson Center style, questions end with an inflection of your voice and a question at the end. So as much as we would like the thoughts and conversations, Marjorie will be staying after for book signing, so there may be some time then to have more sort of a conversational style. Sonia.
Yeah, Sonia Michelle, former Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center and now emerita from the University of Maryland, College Park. Marjorie, it's wonderful to have you here. Wonderful to hear about this book in its finished state. And one of the things I was struck by just now in your response to the question about childcare is, as you know, I've written about it, but I stopped at the veto message, and I didn't know about this whole backstory. So it just shows that history is never completely written, and there are always new things to say when people really dig around and do the research, and so that's a very interesting story. So my question has to do with research. I mean, I think a lot of us here are women's historians, and we know the kinds of questions we ask when we're looking for sort of the good message about feminism or the struggles that feminists had. But how did your techniques change when you were researching conservative women? Did the archives change? Did the questions change? And if you were interviewing them, I mean, how did you manage to sort of contain your own your own views and still elicit the kinds of information and insights that you wanted?
Well, it's a good question, and it was much more difficult initially to find the archives, the sources to look at, and I had to really dig. But once I found one thing, then it led to another, the reason it would be difficult is that there were fewer of the conservatives who left their papers to archives than feminists. But nonetheless, I found some wonderful collections. One of them is the Catherine Dunaway papers at Emory's library, and another one is Elaine Donnelly's papers at the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan. And then, of course, Phyllis Schlafly wrote the Phyllis Schlafly report every month until she died last September. And I believe that her successors, who, by the way, are engaged in a civil war with one another that is extremely interesting, are continuing to carry this on. And then one of the leading figures in the book, Rosemary Thompson, was kind enough to publish in 1978 an account of the entire thing from beginning to end, and then the job got a lot easier. You still, of course, have to corroborate things from every direction, but that got a lot easier. It was harder to find people to interview, but I even found a few cases there. And of course, I interviewed Schlafly herself and was able to, one of the secrets of her success was that she made herself extraordinarily accessible to the press at the time and to scholars since. All I had to do was I sent her an email. I got her email off the Eagle Forum email listserv. I sent it out. I kept wondering, why doesn't she respond? And then I looked in my junk mail, and she had responded within a couple of hours. So I was late getting back to her, and we did a hour and a half interview. And then when I was at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and gave a talk about her, they invited her the next year to come and speak, as she's a Radcliffe alum. And then I was so fortunate that they allowed me to sit next to her at the table. And Jane Mansbridge, author of Why We Lost the ERA, and Nancy Cott, who is a leading figure in women's history, were also at the table. And that was fantastic. So over wine for an hour and a half, we all got to talk and ask her lots of questions, and the only problem was, so anyway, a long-winded answer to your question. It was harder to find the material, but it's there, and it all began to fall together in a good way. And I have found that the conservative women that I've reached out to a number of them after publishing the book, asking for addresses so that I could send them the copies. And it's been extremely gratifying to me, given that one of my goals is to tell the story fairly and accurately, that I've gotten what my husband calls fan mail from some conservative women saying, thank you, someone has finally told our story.
That's fantastic. We've got Audrey back here, and then we'll come up here to...
I'm so glad you called on me. I was at Houston. I'm Audrey Shepherd, and I was at Houston. It was the first women's movement thing that I ever did. I've been doing it ever since, and I feel like my career has totally followed what you've been tracing. I'm going to have to rush out and take a conference call, so I hope there's a time we can talk. But my question would be, and this has just been absolutely fascinating for me, my question is, how do you take the history that you have, traced for us, and what is your theory? We all have our own, as to how we got to the point right now of an administration that wants to roll back the clocks for women so actively, and what I would call, many of us would, a war against women. How did we get here? Is it the triumph of one side over the other? I'm on the other side. How did this happen? How did we let it happen?
Okay, that's an excellent question. It's funny that Bloomsbury, when they asked me to write something that brought it up to the present, we all thought the book would go to press before the election results were over. And so all summer I was finishing that epilogue. First it was sweeping victory by Hillary Clinton, did better in terms of votes from men than anybody else. In other words, what was true in July. And then I revised it again in September, and then Schlafly died, and anyway, it kept going. And later I thought to myself, had the election gone another way, would I have needed to revise it more? And the answer is no, because the story that's told in this book is how we got to the point that we had an election like that. Not so much why it went one way or the other. I think we're still trying to figure that out. But it was how we got to the place where, first of all, a woman finally got nominated by a major party, and secondly, how a man like Trump could get elected despite the clear wishes of the establishment of his own party. And so one thing that I would say is that he was able to, she was able to get the election in part because of the sort of growing demand on the part of women in this country who, and I'll get back to the disappointment there in a minute, but he, in the book, I described that how conservative women played a big role in his winning, and not the least of which was Schlafly, who really saw him as very much like her heroes, Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. And as you know, she wrote the book, A Choice, Not an Echo, which in 1964 helped persuade the Republican Party to nominate their most conservative candidate. It was a debacle, and as a result of that, the more progressives and moderates in their party sort of tried to marginalize her for a long time. So what this book tells is a spectacular comeback that she made to help get Reagan nominated in 1980 and to persuade the party to change its point of view. But she went on to, she remained extraordinarily influential. A lot of people, younger people, had not heard of her, but and I think a lot of currently active liberals in politics believed that she was a relic of the past that was finished. But that woman never stopped, and she was brilliant, and she was media savvy, and as technology evolved and produced new opportunities, she seized them, and so by the time of this last election, she'd had enormous influence. She had helped write and provide materials for the homeschool movement, and the homeschool movement, is really a big. Not everyone, but a lot of them are constituencies that are influential, of children, of voters that grow up to be voters. Her son wrote a Conservapedia because he thinks Wikipedia is too liberal. They had teaching programs for children, and she continued to be on radio several times a week. When I interviewed her, she told me that it had become her hobby to never miss a Republican National Convention and be sure to be there to see that in decade after decade that they never changed the language in the platform that they had put in, that she had helped put in the early 80s. So then in January, she met with Trump. She and Richard Viguerie and a number of others wrote books as the 2016 election was approaching, saying, we are not going along with this autopsy findings that the GOP establishment did that recommended that we take, have a bigger tent, reach out to minorities and more liberal people. We want the most conservative candidate. And so they were very determined that they were going to pick the candidate this time and not allow the GOP establishment to do it. So the question is, which candidate? And it would have been, logically, Cruz, but Schlafly played a major role in getting it for Trump.
Amazing.
And then she went to, even though she was dying of cancer and didn't let that be known, she went to the Republican National Convention to help put down any potential efforts to keep him from getting that nomination. And then during the summer, she worked on a book that was published 2 days after her death in September, calling it The Case for Trump. Then Trump went to the Basilica in St. Louis and gave a eulogy at her funeral, looking skyward, saying, "We will never, ever let you down," and wrapping himself in her mantle. And in a way, his election was her last victory.
Wow. That's
so fascinating. That would not have been anything most of us would know.
That's fascinating. So I think we have a question right here as well. Right here. Yep. Thank you.
Hi, Medora Jones, U.S. Department of Education. And my question had to do with some soul searching after the election, that 53% of white women voted for Trump and in many ways helped give him the edge. And so my question was, where do we go from here? And it sounds like your book gave you some insights as to why this occurred, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah. First of all, I hope after people read this book that they will give up on the idea that has been there ever since 1920 that women were going to block vote. Okay? We all have our own thoughts, our own backgrounds, our own views, and it's, as Nancy Cott once called it, an imaginative construct to think that we're all going to vote the same way. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, it's kind of staggering. However, from 1980 on, one result of the feminist movement has been to encourage more and more women to think of their political choices on a more individualistic basis, and to have ideas about what they want the government to do that have tended to favor the Democratic Party. And so I lay this out in the epilogue that in 1980 there were visible two trends that proved to be enduring. One was this gender gap favoring Democrats, and the other was that women turned out to vote in larger numbers than men for the first time in peacetime in history. Women at first didn't take advantage of the vote nearly as much as men. So that has continued. So politicians ever since 1980 have certainly needed to pay attention to the women's vote. But we as a nation should not have been so surprised that so many women voted for him, because this gender gap is largely the result of the votes of single women and minority women. And the Republicans have been busily pointing out ever since the gender gap was first noticed that married women, white married women, tend to vote Republican. Mm-hmm. So this is not anything new. The fact is that Hillary did better with these women than any of the other candidates leading in recent years leading up to this, including Obama. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's in the middle of the summer, it looked like she was really going to get a lot more of those votes. And then I believe that another conservative woman by the name of Kellyanne Conway, was brought in. She had a specialty in rescuing Republican men from big mistakes. Mm-hmm. She had been doing that for several years. You may remember, how could you forget, the one about women's bodies shutting things down and therefore you can't get pregnant by rape. You know, that guy, she was brought in to help save his candidacy. And by the way, Phyllis Schlafly stood behind him on the stands, urging him not to drop out of the race after that. And so Kellyanne was brought in, and I believe she sits like Phyllis Schlafly. She's brilliant at turning a question around to make it one she wants to answer, like Schlafly. And she succeeded in helping Trump pull a victory out of what appeared to be a sure defeat. And she basically helped make him more palatable to Republican women. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact, as well as the Comey letter, that made a lot of these women who were tending to vote for Hillary Clinton to change their mind toward the end.
And that fits in with the number of women in Congress tend to come not only from the Democratic Party, but come from urban areas and tend to represent populations that are more single. There's probably some statistically term. Mm-hmm. But I think you've brought us to a point where I think it's perfect to wrap this up, because you made the comment earlier on that it took you longer to do the book than you had anticipated, but your book has come out at the right time. Not only the right time to show that the women's movement is not united, there is not sort of one women's movement or one woman, and as we run a global project, very aware, but also at a time with what Audrey brought up, which is, where are we now? We are divided now. Many parts of the world are divided, sort of populism versus not. And so this division and competition, the difference between sort of the advocacy piece of it and, let's say, the party piece of it or the policies, but that the progress is there, that the women's issues are on the agenda. They still get to be discussed, perhaps not discussed in the way we would like in terms of process. Not all of the outcomes are not going to please all women, because we all have different outcomes that we would like, but that there is progress, that hopefully we can unite. And I think what was also interesting was, talking a lot about the language we use, and even back in 1977 and today, talking about how we get that message out. Where are we talking? What are we doing with the media? What are we doing with our networks? What are we writing down, right? And I think that this book will only be the start, hopefully, of the next epilogues or the follow-up to sort of where do we go from now. But thank you so much. And Marjorie will be here after this, signing her books. She will also be at Politics and Prose this evening as well.
Yes, at 7 o'clock this evening, and there I'll give a longer talk about the book. Not too long, but okay.
But we're very honored, Marjorie. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming this morning to the Wilson Summit.
Thank you for the invitation.
I know, I had